to be here to present Kostas Kampourakis. That is someone I had the opportunity to have to get in touch this year, but not only in 21. Kostas is a colleague linked with in many works we've done before. I will make your presentation in Portuguese, okay, Kostas? I'm sorry, but
no problem.
I see that even in the YouTube are only Brazilians, at least the ones that said hello. So, Kostas Kampourakis é o autor e editor de livros, vários livros de evolução, de genética, de filosofia e história da ciência, e é o editor de uma série de livros recentes da Cambridge University Press, chamados Understanding Life, que está sendo um sucesso editorial, na medida em que a série está crescendo bastante, num ritmo bastante acelerado, talvez aí até na época da pandemia, mas com muitos títulos bem importantes para quem ensina e estuda a biologia. Ele é também importante lembrar que ele foi editor da revista Science and Education, que é a revista focada, né, na interface entre história, filosofia, estudos sociais da ciência e educação científica. E ele é editor também de uma série de livros chamado Filosofia, História e Educação, da Springer. Ele atualmente é pesquisador na Universidade de Geneva, na Suíça, onde ele também ensina tanto na seção de biologia quanto no Instituto de Educação Científica da universidade. So, it is a pleasure again to have you, Kostas. So, if you want to start, please be welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And following Peter's excellent talk, I'm going to talk about slightly different and more theoretical. So I'll just share my screen. Hope that. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about students' misconceptions in evolution education, and a term that has been discussed a lot in the science education literature, teleology and students' teleological misconceptions. And through quasi-philosophical analysis, I'm going to argue that it's not teleology that is the problem, but rather the design stance that underlies students' thinking. So, to start with a simple question, if we ask anyone around us, why do we have a heart? An immediate response will be in order to pump blood. And actually, when we teach physiology in schools and in universities, we explain how the muscle that we see here, the heart, works in order to achieve this function. So the question is the explanation we have a heart in order to pump blood a legitimate one, a scientifically legitimate one for the presence of a heart? In other words, does it really explain the presence of the heart? So in order to address this, we have to consider what exactly we're asking and which are the possible responses. So here we're asking a why question. Why do we have a heart? And we're going to consider different kinds of causes that can be used, invoked to explain and provide an explanation and an answer to this question. The first kind of causes are ultimate causes, and these are backward-looking and, of course, refer to the evolution of the organ. There are also proximate causes, which are also backward-looking, but at this point they refer to the development in an individual. The previous one was the evolution in a population or a species. And of course, we have the final causes, which are forward-looking and refer to a goal or role. This means that if we ask the question, why do we have a heart, we can give three kinds of causal explanations. we can give an evolutionary explanation that says that we have a heart because there was selection for this organ that thus became prevalent in the ancestors of mammals, for instance. We can give a developmental explanation, saying, for instance, that we have a heart because the cells in that area of the body of the individual were differentiated to become heart muscle. And we can have the physiological explanation that refers to the function of the heart in order to pump blood. So we can have an evolution explanation that refers to causes, a developmental explanation that also refers to causes, and a teleological explanation that refers to the function. And the big question is the last one a legitimate scientifically explanation? Here is a summary of what I just presented. By the way, I should mention that this presentation is based on a paper that is published in the Journal of Evolution, Education and Outreach, and it is actually the first time ever that I'm presenting something that has been published as a paper, but exactly because I've never presented this in a talk, I thought it would be useful to do this here. So let us think about teleological explanations. If you look at a dictionary, there's a reference to purpose and to what something serves at doing. Purpose, goal, function. Here are two examples. And actually the Greek term is teleology, not teleology, but it is the way it is adopted that has now made teleology the main term. So we can say that the teleological explanation is a mode of explanation in which a phenomenon is explained in terms of a final end. This is what telos means in Greek, to which it contributes. And we usually see the expressions like in order to, for the sake of, so that. And there is a huge philosophical literature in the philosophy of biology about teleology. Here I just mentioned some overviews. The discussions are going usually back to Plato, and we can roughly say that Platonic teleological explanations are, in a sense, unnatural. Whatever is explained in teleological terms exists because it was intentionally created for a purpose. And Plato assigned that to the demiurge, or demiurgos, who designed the world as we see it. His student Aristotle came up with a different kind of teleology. In that case, teleological explanations were natural. And whatever is explained in teleological terms exists because it has some positive consequences for its possessor without any intentionality or design. So there is an important distinction to note here. We have teleological explanations that can be based on design. Something exists because of its consequences that contribute to the fulfillment of an external agent's intention to achieve a goal. And so intentional design is assumed. But we can have teleological explanations based on natural processes. In this case, something exists because of its consequences that contribute to the well-being of its possessor. There is no assumption of intentional design. To illustrate this, we can think that if we want to explain how these brown beetles have ended up having brown color in this brown environment, knowing that they started from another population that consisted of both green and brown beetles, we can explain this, and this is what students usually do, on the basis of need, purpose, and plan. The green ones changed to brown ones in order to be able to conceal themselves in the particular environment. And this is what we can describe as design teleology. Attention, I'm not saying that this is a Platonic teleology, but it has similarities with that. Another way to explain this would be to say that from the initial population of the green and the brown beetles, only the brown ones survived because the predators, the birds, for instance, could spot and eat the green ones. And this is what we can describe as selection teleology. Once again, this is not Aristotelian teleology, but it has some useful similarities. So, the important point is that what we see in evolutionary theory, starting with Darwin, as Jim Lennox explained in this provocatively titled paper, Darwin was a teleologist, is that if we want to explain the existence of brown color in a population, we can say that brown color has an effect, a positive effect, which is concealment. So this concealment is advantageous to avoid predators to its bearers in the population. Therefore, this color would be selectively favored because more individuals would survive and reproduce, more brown individuals would survive and reproduce compared to the green ones. And therefore, the concealment is the cause of the traits of the brown color presence in the population P. So Jim explains here that this is a robust form of teleology. Something is explained, the presence of a feature is explained on the basis of what it does and of the kind of advantage it confers. So, some first conclusions are that explanations based on natural selection are teleological, in the sense that I just explained. Explanations based on natural selection are also causal, because causes relate to past events. And teleological explanations based on design are also causal, because causes relate to intentions and intentional design. Therefore, the distinction between causal and teleological that we sometimes see in the science educational literature can be misleading. Also, marking teleology as bad, as a problem, is also misleading because teleological explanations are the explanations that we usually end up having if we invoke natural selection. And I'm going now to argue that the problem with students' conceptions is not teleology, but design. So here again, here's a summary of the main features. We see that we can have three types of teleological explanations. Design teleological explanations, which are external due to an external agent, or internal due to an internal factor inside the organism. And we can also have selection that, contrary to the other two, makes no assumption of design. Let us now look a bit at research on students' teleological explanations. There is a lot of research that shows that students think that animals, especially, but also other organisms, can adapt if they need to do something, and especially if they have sufficient time. Ask any student what will happen if there is sufficient time, and they will tell you that organisms are going to adapt, sometimes intentionally, as this image shows. In many cases, we have seen that students believe that whenever an organism needs something, this organism, this individual is going to get it, especially, as I said, if there's enough time, because this is how they perceive adaptation, giving organisms, individuals, what they need. And this is emphasized sometimes by TV programs, usually natural history documentaries or nature documentaries, which present the concealment of animals, as you see this frog here, in the same sense, in the same way that students might think of the concealment of this soldier here. So knowing that the soldier will use this uniform to conceal himself from the enemy, students extrapolate this kind of thinking, saying that the animals do the same. But of course, this is not how nature works. Then we have other books that use metaphors which are quite anthropomorphic, the blind watchmaker, the tinkerer's accomplice, which of course makes sense among scientists and philosophers and historians who know why Dawkins or Francois Jacob was the first to use the tinkerer metaphor mean, but they may be very misleading for non-experts. And of course, we have other representations of evolution that shows, for instance, human evolution, as you see here, towards a final end, which is, in a sense, another kind of representation of the great chain of being of the 18th and the 19th century. At the same time, we have research, like this research here by Marcus Hammond, that suggests that when students explain their preference for teleological explanations, they often focus not teleologically on purposes and goals, but rather on functions, which they found familiar and relevant. In other words, we can give students a questionnaire and they may choose teleological explanations, and then we say, oh, they are teleologists, they think in terms of purpose and design. But when we discuss with them and we ask them why things happen, we may end up realizing that it's not purpose or goal necessarily, but function. And function is something that, of course, has a role, but in a different sense than something that is designed. So the big question here is how we think of organisms and how we distinguish them from artifacts, especially when machine metaphors are predominant in biology and in the teaching of biology. This now brings us to the design stance. There is a lot of research in psychology that shows that from early childhood, people tend to think in terms of purpose and design. They have deep intuitions about purpose and design in nature, which persist to adulthood. To present some studies very briefly, there was a series of studies asking children and adults to explain why entities, objects have specific features. And what this body of studies found was that for organisms and artifacts, the response was that there is a feature because it serves a purpose, a function, a role. According to this body of research led by Frank Kyle, this is not something they did for natural objects like rocks and clouds. So students and children and adults might say that an organism may have, like this plant, may have thorns to protect itself, and in this case, protection is self-serving, whereas an artifact like this barbed wire can have barbs because they protect something that we humans want to protect. But in both cases, they perceive the purpose. In contrast, they did not give this kind of explanations for natural objects like emeralds. So for a plant, like a green plant you see here, they would say that they are green in order to survive. Whereas for a natural object like an emerald, they would say that it consists of green parts, even though this explanation is very legitimate and very correct for the plant. The plant has chloroplasts with chlorophyll, and that's why it's green. Another body of research by Deborah Kellerman has shown that students, children, and adults, especially young children, tend to give teleological explanations for everything, including objects which are not living. So they would say that we have babies for loving them, we have clocks for telling the hour, we have rocks and mountains for climbing, we have clouds for raining. And of course, the question here is, what is going on? Whatever the case, the first important conclusion is that in all these studies, there was a tendency by participants to provide teleological explanations for organisms and artifacts. And this is, in my view, the biggest problem. Now, we tried 10 years ago to replicate this kind of research and see what happens. So we showed students pictures of organisms that were familiar and unfamiliar. The familiar are on the left, the unfamiliar on the right, artifacts and non-living natural objects. And we asked them to provide explanations for these. And what we found, this was a studies done with preschool students, grade 1 students, and grade 2 students at the elementary school. We found that teleological explanations declined with age. Of course, there was not a longitudinal study. These are 3 cross-sectional studies, but the tendency was we saw was that the younger the students, the more teleological explanations they gave. However, when we analyzed the explanations separately for organisms, artifacts, and natural objects, we saw that those explanations that really declined were the explanations for natural objects, like rocks and clouds. Whereas, as you can see here, they kept giving teleological explanations for organisms and artifacts. So this might point to a shift from the teleology that we saw in the beginning, the generalized teleology by Kellerman, perhaps to one more specific to organisms and artifacts, as that proposed by Frank Kyle, but the answer is that we do not really know. Nevertheless, what is most important in my view is that organisms and artifacts go together. And of course, there's also other psychological research that shows that people in general tend to think in terms of design and purpose. And this is sometimes what also makes religion something easy to accept. Now, returning to the big question, what is the difference between organisms and artifacts? And what is perhaps what we don't want students to conflate? If we ask the question, why do birds have wings? The most intuitive answer would be in order to fly, especially if we showed people this photo of the eagle. However, if we show them the penguins, the response, would be different. In order to swim, just because they cannot fly. And they would be entirely puzzled if we showed them an ostrich, because at that point they would not know what to do. So we see already that there's a big issue here. We can have a question and provide an explanation for which stands and works well for some organisms of the same group, simply put, but not for all of them. Of course, we could ask other questions. Why do eagles fly? Why do penguins swim? Not sure what we would ask here. And the answer would be, in the first two cases, because they have wings, among other features such as light skeleton and things like that. But returning to the question, the initial question, if we ask why do birds have wings, a more scientifically legitimate response would be because they have evolved from a common ancestor with wings who had an advantage because of the wings, which were thus selected, etc., etc., etc. So an evolutionary explanation would be more appropriate. But does this mean that we have to get rid of the functional explanation or an explanation that makes reference to function? No, I don't think so. Of course, whenever we talk about adaptation, it is useful to refer to history, to what happened in the past, to evolutionary history. But this does not mean that we cannot refer to function. What we can do, however, is make the distinction between organisms and artifacts. If we ask why organisms have wings, we saw that there are difficulties. But if we ask why do airplanes have wings, there's no problem, because the explanation, the answer in order to fly, works perfectly for everything. Airplanes are artifacts intentionally designed for a purpose, which is to fly. And there is no airplane that doesn't have wings in order to fly. There are, of course, other aircrafts like helicopters, but they are not airplanes. So I think that the big issue here is to make this distinction and point out two crucial differences between organisms and artifacts. Organisms are not intentionally designed, artifacts are. And the second, organisms do not have fixed essences, artifacts do. The problem now is that research in psychology shows that people tend to think exactly on the opposite way. They think that the essences of organisms are fixed, and they think that the parts of organisms exist for a purpose because they were designed, and these are two of the most important conceptual obstacles to understanding evolution. So here's again a summary, and here's the important point I want you to take home from this talk. We can make an observation more broadly saying that organisms have structure A that performs function B. Now, the problem is not if we say that structure A exists in order to perform function B. This is the first inference we make, which is the teleological inference. There's no problem if we do that. The problem is in the second inference you see on the right, the consequence etiology, how we justify this teleological inference. This is the problem. So we can say that something exists for a purpose insofar as we refer to natural selection, and to say that something exists because it conferred an advantage and so it was selected. The problem is in the first two cases if we refer to design teleology, either external or internal. In other words, Whenever we see students' responses of this kind, that something exists in order to perform a function, in order to serve a role, this on its own does not tell us much. We have to look deeper at the consequence etiology underlying this explanation in order to better understand how students think. And here's again another kind of summary with some examples. The important point is that design teleology is legitimate for artifacts, selection teleology is legitimate for organisms, and the internal design teleology is not legitimate for any of this. So it might be useful right from the start of schooling to make this distinction to young children. How we explain the presence of particular traits in artifacts and in organisms. And this is how I think we should address the design stance. What we usually see in elementary and kindergartens, elementary schools and kindergarten, is the distinction between living and non-living. And teachers in elementary schools spend hours explaining to kids the properties of organisms and why we do not find all of them in non-living entities. And perhaps there they can make the distinction between artifacts and non-living natural objects. So my suggestion is that we should change that. And we should begin by distinguishing between designed and not designed entities. And leaving artifacts aside, explaining to students that artifacts are designed by humans for a purpose, we could then refer to natural objects which are organisms, but also ones that are not living, as I said, like clouds and rocks. Why is that? Some psychologists think that because we grow up surrounded by artifacts since our first days, we tend to be familiar and to get used to the presence of objects around us that are used for a purpose. Just think how many artifacts were around you when you were a baby or a young or an infant, and how many organisms were around you. So what they suggest is that perhaps we become from a very young age familiar with the intentional use of objects through our experience with artifacts, and we extrapolate that then to nature. If this is the case, and this is something that we do not really know at this point, perhaps making this distinction instead of the previous one here might work. But of course, we need empirical studies to tell us, to show us that this actually works. What else we can do? We can tell students that organisms are neither intelligently designed nor perfectly adapted. And perhaps we do not say the first one, but we often say the second one. And how can we challenge that? We can give them different kinds of examples of organisms living in nature, not having the perfect adaptation, what we might think as perfect adaptation. Another example, one that I used to use actually when I was a teacher at school, we see that gray whale with its baby swimming around. If you ask students, why do these whales have hydrodynamic shapes? They will tell you that they have hydrodynamic shapes in order to swim fast underwater. And same for these orcas here. However, as the documentary proceeds, the orcas manage to separate the mom from the baby, and then they push the baby down in the water until it's drowned. And then if you ask students, why don't these sea organisms have gills like fish, they have no answer to give. And here's another simple example to show students that organisms have some adaptive features, but not all their features are adaptive. And this is a first step to begin challenging their preconception and misconception of perfect adaptation. And to put this more philosophically, we can ask if we can say that organisms have a specific trait in order to perform a function, and apply these in two ways. In a design teleology sense, organisms have a trait to perform function B because all organisms have the features that are necessary for their survival. And a selection teleology that says that organisms have a trait in order to perform a function because the latter confers an advantage, and this trait has been selected for doing this and has been maintained in their lineage. If we apply this to sharks and dolphins, we will see that we can explain the hydrodynamic shapes both ways, both in terms of design teleology and in terms of selection teleology. However, excuse me, that was the case for the dolphins and the sharks. We can say that they have something that they need because it's necessary for the survival and because it is something that has been selected. However, a third question, if we ask why don't dolphins have gills, when it comes to design teleology, things are complicated. We might say that dolphins do not have gills, but have lungs in order to get more oxygen directly from the atmosphere, because organisms have the features that are necessary for their survival. But then, for an organism that lives in the same environment, we would give a different explanation that could also say that dolphins do not have gills because this feature was not maintained in their lineage and because lungs evolved in their terrestrial ancestors. We can give entirely different explanations with design teleology and selection teleology for the dolphins and then for the sharks. In one case, we would say that sharks have something that is necessary for their survival. In the other case, we would say that having gills is an advantage. So all in all, the problem is that if you look at all these together, is that under the premises of design teleology, we have to make different assumptions for organisms living in the same environment. Whereas with selection teleology, we have coherence, we have consistent explanations. So, to conclude with what I've been showing you, is the explanation we have a heart in order to pump blood a legitimate one for the presence of a heart? My answer is yes, but we have to make clear reference, especially in schools, to evolutionary causes and processes, the fact that organisms are not designed, and the possible alternative outcomes of evolution if the antecedent conditions have been different. Now, here we have to be cautious because I'm not arguing that we should use natural selection to explain everything, but philosophers agree that whenever we seem to have adaptation, it is natural selection that was the causal process that brought about this adaptation. So, in other words, if we want to talk about adaptation, to teach adaptation to students, we should make reference to natural selection. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Kostas. A great talk. I hope we have many biologists and biology teachers here, and students, biology students also, in history of biology, to talk with you. Yeah, Sibel, it's you. I was looking if it was a question in YouTube.
So thank you very much, Kostas, for your fantastic talk. And you made me wonder about how original indigenous peoples would think about the distinctions you presented, considering that they are not grown up surrounded by artifacts as us, but by organisms.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And my answer is I don't really know for two reasons. Unfortunately, most of the research that we have in psychology has been done in Western societies, mostly United States, Canada, and Europe. There's a great book by Joe Henrich talking about weird people. Weird means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and I forget what D means, democratic. And most of the research that we have, especially in teleology, but also essentialism, come from these countries. Some groups, like the group of Deborah Kellerman, have also done research in Chinese people, and I think Roma and some others, but we do not really know, globally, what people tend to think. Now, I would like to challenge the assumption that even indigenous people do not grow up surrounded by artifacts, because I'm sure they're using tools. Perhaps these are not the artifacts that we find in Europe or the States, but they probably using tools and they are familiar with the intentional use of objects. Nevertheless, I also understand that this would be very, very different from, you know, living in a city somewhere in Europe, in the States. And we would probably need to have, you know, comparative studies and compare the perceptions. I think this would be very interesting, but I'm not familiar with this kind of research so far.
Thank you.
Okay. Roberto Martins posted his question. I don't know if you are reading it, Kostas?
Yeah, yes, I read it.
So, and afterwards I would add something by myself, but you can answer him first.
Yeah, so the question is if I could point out which features of Aristotle's final causes are adequate or inadequate according to current views. I'm not sure what you mean by current views, if you mean the philosophy of biology. So Jim Lennox, who developed, among other philosophers, the view I presented, to which I also subscribe, is a student of Aristotle. And of course, he based this development on Aristotle because, of course, Aristotle was not a Darwinian, but the consequence etiology that he's using is the one that we will find in Darwin, that something exists on the basis of what it does. I'm not sure if this answers your question. Of course, if we go back to Aristotle, there are enormous differences. And as I said, we wouldn't say that Aristotle was a Darwinian or Darwin was an Aristotelian, but the view that Darwin, in order to make his theory successful, he had to destroy Aristotelian essentialism and Aristotle's causes is not entirely accurate.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sure. I like to hear you talking about that, and I would just answer you. I would like to ask you if I agree that we have to, and I enjoy your suggestion to start teaching children with designed and not designed things, and just remembering that this is something that comes from Aristotle also, art and nature distinction. So it is surely related with teleology thinking. But before teaching to children, don't we need to teach this to teachers?
Absolutely.
Just because you mentioned Jim Lennox is considered an exception or just a guy between very few of them, of philosophers that don't blame Aristotle and everything, and mainly in teleology. So, yeah.
No, it's not that Aristotle is the problem, and I'm not saying this because I'm Greek. I'm saying this because
Yes. This is important too. Sorry.
Well, someone once asked me if I support Aristotle and Jim's view because I'm Greek, and I'm saying clearly this is not the reason. The reason is that, of course, Aristotle's philosophy is quite complex, and my knowledge is superficial compared to Jim's. Actually, Jim had just published a book I have not received yet in Cambridge University Press about the processes of inquiry in Aristotle, and I'm sure I have a lot to learn. But what I would like to say is that when we deal with teachers, we can use these sophisticated frameworks to create and produce simple distinctions like the one I presented. I mean, distinguish between artifacts and organisms is something that we can do. Distinguish between artifacts and natural objects is a clear distinction that can be made. Now, if you ask me, I've taught classes with elementary teachers here. Whenever I ask a question about teleology, everybody gets it wrong. Why? Because it's an intuitive view that psychologists have established that comes to mind naturally and proceeds into adulthood. So what we could do, of course, would be to begin with teacher education. But all I'm trying to say is that if we deal with secondary teachers only, it's too late. if secondary teachers try to address these misconceptions. I was a secondary teacher myself for 12 years, and I always saw this problem. And that's why in my school, we try to do this research with younger kids. And I was trying to convince the elementary teachers that they have to make this distinction clear to children. Now, of course, when this intuition is so strong in teachers themselves, who, by the way, do not have sufficient training in biology because they are elementary teachers, it becomes hard. But I think the main point I want to make is that when it comes to this fundamental understanding of what is what, it is too late to wait for secondary school. We have to try something earlier to address these deep intuitions of teachers and students, of course, and explaining this to teachers might be a first step. But someone has to do this in a large scale to see if it works.
Yes, yes, thank you. I think Peter Hearing wants to make a question.
Yes. Thank you, Kostas, for a great talk. I really enjoyed that. This might be more of non-biologist's question, but what about breeding? So we have extra long pigs who are bred in a way that they have more ribs, which is attractive for farming. Is this designed or not designed? What about dogs who look particularly cute because they are bred in a particular way that they appear cute?
Yeah, absolutely. This is artificial selection, and this is entirely a guided, intentional process.
Okay.
Actually, this is where the idea of natural selection came. Darwin was involved in breeding, and he saw that if breeders can choose all these features the way they want, what could happen in nature? But the big difference is that in the case of artificial selection, we have an intelligent person, agent, that makes the choices what to breed with what, and we can guide the outcome wherever we want. But this is not how nature works. And this is also what might make natural selection a bad metaphor, because the big question would be, if we are talking about artificial selection, humans make the selection. What happens in nature? The solution was found by Darwin when he came up with the principle of divergence. And he said that there is competition in nature, and it is this competition that eventually drives divergence towards one or the other direction, and has the same effect with artificial selection.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Great, Kostas. And I'm remembering the lectures we had this semester in these topics. Luisi Trevisol wrote in the YouTube, she appreciates if you, Kostas, could comment a little more about Darwin being a teleologist. I think it's interesting to force a strange look to theories that we are very used to. And also, she would like to add that it was very elucidating, the introduction to this notion that the problem is not teleology itself and maybe tautological explanations, but the design. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, there are other philosophers who have written about this. Now, Robert Brandon comes to mind. I don't remember. There are probably others. I don't remember right now. But Jim has this nice short paper published in Biology and Philosophy in 1993, where he explains and he provides the schema I produced, and where he says that if we see something that is there performing a function, then we can say that it is there because it was selected on the basis of what it does. So the reason it is there is the advantage it confers because of what it does. And this, Jim says, is a robust form of teleology, because teleology means something is there for a role, for a purpose, for a function. The difference is, how did it come to be there? And the answer, the crucial answer, is it was selected. It was not designed. So, in other words, the distinction I made between the first inference and the second inference, it's no problem if we say that we have hearts to pump blood, The problem is if we do not explain how we ended up having hearts with the specific features they have. And of course, there's a gradual evolution from simpler hearts in other mammals towards the heart that we have, and of course, different kinds of hearts in different organisms. So all in all, as I said, we can say that something exists for a purpose insofar we refer to natural selection and to how something ended up being an adaptation or performing a function. Now, this brings us to another philosophical discussion. Are all functions adaptations? But this would require a whole talk. That's the debate going back to the 70s between Larry Wright and Robert Cummins, and whether functions are historical or ahistorical. But that would be a whole talk to discuss. But you can refer to this literature because it's enlightening.
Thank you, Kostas. I think it's great what Louise mentioned is that you stressed that the notion of that the problem is not teleology itself. It's important for us, like historians of biology and as teachers of biology, because the main discourse is that teleology is always linked with agency. So one biologist cannot talk teleologically, and this is the mainstream. This is what everybody. So this is why I provoked you. We will have to change the mind of many people to get the point we have.
Yeah, of course, there's also the question of how one defines teleology, because some people might choose to include design in the definition. But a purpose, a final end, telos, does not require design in the sense that I explained, actually in the sense that Jim Lennox has explained, because that's the one I'm also following. Of course, if someone defines teleology differently, and this includes design, then teleology is a problem. But as I said, is it wrong to say that we have hearts in order to pump blood? What Jim has explained is that Galen and others, they managed to figure out how organisms and systems work by asking this kind of questions. And asking teleological questions has had in history a great heuristic value in order to understand systems. So the big point in my view is that telos, goal, purpose, role, function is not a problem. The big question for students, because I have to add that my main concern in this discussion is not what is philosophically correct only, but also how to use philosophy in teaching, is if students have a well-established design stance, they see things in terms of design, then this is the one we have to address and explain to them why organisms are not designed by God, nature, or whatever one might think of.
Sure. Thank you. Thais, I'm not sure I'm with the...
There's a comment by Silvia Figueroa on YouTube.
Yeah, I don't know, my other computer
Anyway,
here can't read, so...
Professor Silvia Figueroa thanks you, Kostas, for the very insightful talking. Thais?
Eu tenho uma pergunta, mas eu gostaria de fazer em português. Uma de vocês traduz para ele, pelo fato de adentrar o texto da teologia, eu não sei se vou usar o vocabulário correto. É o seguinte, no caso, se eles enfrentam no contexto dele aquelas famílias que acreditam, professam um criacionismo, são adeptos de um design inteligente, questões familiares muito arraigadas nas famílias. E quando os professores, se é que fazem uma certa imposição, né, da perspectiva científica frente a essas crianças, se isso causa, se eles observam, uma dissonância cognitiva com relação à ciência. Não sei se eu fui clara.
I will try. Sibel may help me. Thais would like to know if you know about the cases where the family of the children are creationists, and if this kind of faith would impact the cognitive way of they answer this kind of questions. For instance, your research show it.
In the case teachers impose their point of view in a disrespectful way to that familiar values, beliefs.
Your microphone is just switched off.
I don't know, I didn't mute that. Sorry, I was just saying that these are interesting questions, but there are more than one. So I will try to answer them one by one. The first is that there is indeed research that shows that, especially at the age between 6 and 10, all children were giving creationist explanations independently of the religiosity of their family. So this means that it is just intuitive. And this is both the work by Deborah Kellerman and by Margaret Evans. 6 to 10 in one case, 7 to 10 in the other case. Of course, later as they grow up, things change. Some students who grow up in a more open environment are more open to accept the scientific view than the creationist view. And I'm not saying the religious view, because I do not want to compare science to religion. I'm comparing science to creationism, because creationism, the way it is used, is not science. It's something different. That's one point. Now, the second point, if I understood correctly, you're concerned about the teachers who try to impose the scientific view on religious students or students from religious families. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Okay, this is a problem. I mean, I always say that Richard Dawkins, for instance, he says that he wrote on the back cover of Jerry Cohen's book, Why Evolution is True, is that I used to say that whoever does not accept evolution is stupid, ignorant. And now I will add that whoever does not accept evolution is stupid, ignorant, or has not read Richard Cohen. But of course, this is not the way to address the problem. Historian Adam Latz once wrote on his Twitter account something that I find magnificent. He says that asking Richard Dawkins and Jerry Cohen about creationism is like asking a cardiologist about heartbreak. And of course, the cardiologist knows how the heart works, but he cannot help you if you're sad, if you're in love and you don't get the response you want to get. What does this mean? It means that creationism is not only about conceptual obstacles, but it's also about emotional obstacles. And my friend and colleague Michael Rice has written several papers saying that we need to address these religious worldviews, and especially when it comes to creationism, as a sensitive issue, because we're not going to convince people to consider science if we tell them that they're stupid or ignorant. We have to take this to consider these in a different way from the conceptual part, and that's why I find the distinction between conceptual obstacles and emotional obstacles very, very different and very important. What I present today is exclusively at the conceptual level. So the emotional level is different, and of course teachers should be prepared to deal with this. But unfortunately, this is far from simple and straightforward. Just to give you an example, in my classes with teachers on evolution, I present them the example of a teacher from another canton here in Switzerland, in Lausanne, who says that I work in a religious school and I have to give parents what they expect to get from the religious school. So I have to present creationism as well. This is my obligation, because this is why parents bring their kids to this school. And this is an argument that it's difficult to fight, because it is true, the case. The public schools here are secular and there are no such issues, but I show this to students, to teachers, this religious teacher who thinks otherwise, in order to show that it's not about who is right and who is wrong. It's about worldviews and values that, in my view, fall outside the scope of science. But of course, when it comes to teaching, we have to consider this, because, as you know, teachers are not only there to transmit knowledge, they do other things. They form people, and their influence has to be positive. And of course, it's not positive if we try to impose things. So my suggestion to teachers is that try to listen to people, to what they believe, and try to show them that science is not a threat, because it operates at a particular level of understanding. Beyond that, they can accept that there are different kinds of knowledge. Religious knowledge is one thing. Moral knowledge is another thing. This is what epistemology says.
Great. Antonio Pinto asks in Portuguese here, so if it's possible to say the same thing about the teaching of theories such as the origin of universe.
Evolutionary theory can explain what...
Origin of the universe.
Yeah. We can explain the origin of life, in the sense that it has been shown that it is possible to end up with cells from molecules in the primordial soup or whatever. The problem with that is that the further we go back in time, there's always a question. And eventually there may be things that we will not be able to answer. The origin of the universe is something that perhaps Peter knows more about me to answer. Is the domain of physics, of particles or whatever. I don't think that evolutionary theory has something to say there. And the problem is that I think is more fundamental here. We tend to think in terms of beginnings and ends, and whenever we find an explanation for something, there will always be something behind that, and behind that, and behind that, that we might not be able to explain. But I don't think that this devalue at all the natural explanations that we have for the origin of the life that we see today.
Okay, thank you. Since we don't have any more questions and we are 4 o'clock, so I'm going to finish this session today. Thank you, Kostas. Thank you, Peter, and everybody that is here until now with us in this celebration of GHTC group. And you are welcome to come next Friday. We'll have Sibel, help me there. We'll have
next Friday, Alejandro Martín Lopes, Histórias de las Ciencias, Aportes de la Astronomia Cultural, e Pablo Lorenzano, História, Teoria e Enseñanza de las Ciencias, el caso de Gregor Mendel e uma genética clássica. São 2 argentinos.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
So if our guests want to stay a little bit for chatting, it would be great.
Yeah.
Vou encerrar a transmissão, ok?
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Encerrada.
Okay.
Transmission is over.
Now we stop recording.
Yeah, I stopped too. Kostas, let's